Welcome to Sinister States.
The first time anyone noticed that Daniel was missing, the sun was already low behind the ridgeline, and the air in the valley had turned cold enough to bite. The search party would later say that the forest felt different that evening, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. But at the time, no one thought much of it. People got lost in the wild all the time, especially in the old-growth forests that sprawled across the northern slopes. Daniel was just another hiker, another city kid with a borrowed backpack and a map he'd printed off the internet. He'd come up from the city with his girlfriend, Mara, and 2 friends, all of them eager for a weekend away from the noise and the heat. They'd parked at the trailhead, shouldered their packs, and set off into the woods, laughing and shouting as they crossed the first stream. Daniel was the quiet one, always a few steps behind, pausing to take photos of mossy rocks and the way the sunlight filtered through the canopy. Mara teased him for it, but he just smiled and said he liked to remember things the way they really were, not just how they looked in his head. By the time they reached the old fire tower, the sky was streaked with orange and purple, and the air smelled of pine and wood smoke. They set up camp in a clearing, built a small fire, and cooked instant noodles in a battered pot. Mara and the others drank cheap whiskey from a plastic bottle, passing it around and telling stories about haunted houses and things that lived in the dark. Daniel listened, but he didn't say much. He kept glancing at the trees, as if he could see something moving just beyond the firelight. Later, when the others had crawled into their tents, Daniel stayed up, poking at the embers and watching the shadows shift. Mara called to him, her voice muffled by the nylon walls, but he didn't answer. He just sat there, listening to the wind in the branches and the distant call of an owl. He thought about his childhood, about the woods behind his grandparents' house, and the stories his grandfather used to tell him about the things that lived in the wild, things that were older than the trees, older than the mountains themselves. He must have dozed off, because the next thing he knew, the fire was out and the world was silent. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, twisted shadows across the clearing. Daniel stood up, brushing ash from his jeans, and looked around. The tents were dark and still. He felt a sudden urge to walk, to see what the forest looked like at night. He grabbed his flashlight and slipped away, careful not to wake the others. The trail was easy to follow at first, the beam of his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the undergrowth. But as he walked, the trees seemed to close in around him, their branches arching overhead like the ribs of some ancient beast. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the night faded until all he could hear was the crunch of his boots on the leaf litter. He tried to turn back, but the path was gone, swallowed by the darkness. He kept walking, hoping to find a landmark, a fallen log, or a patch of moonlight that would lead him back to camp. But the forest was endless, a maze of shadows and silence. He called out for Mara, for anyone, but his voice was swallowed by the trees. Panic rose in his chest, hot and sharp, but he forced himself to keep moving. He remembered his grandfather's words. "The woods are alive, Danny. They remember everything. If you get lost, you have to be quiet. You have to listen." So he listened. He stood still, closed his eyes, and let the sounds of the forest wash over him. At first, there was nothing. Then, slowly, he began to hear things. The rustle of leaves, the distant trickle of water, the soft, rhythmic thump of something moving through the undergrowth. He opened his eyes and saw a faint glow ahead, like the reflection of moonlight on water. He moved toward it, careful not to make a sound. The glow led him to a small clearing, where the ground was soft and spongy underfoot. In the center of the clearing stood a tree unlike any he had ever seen. Its trunk was twisted and black, its branches bare except for a few withered leaves that glowed with a pale, sickly light. The air around the tree was thick and heavy, and Daniel felt a pressure in his chest, as if the forest itself was watching him. He stepped closer, drawn by the strange light. As he reached out to touch the bark, he heard a voice, a low, whispering sound that seemed to come from the roots of the tree. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, desperate. He knelt down, pressing his ear to the ground, and the voice grew louder, filling his head with images of lost children, of bones buried beneath the moss, of eyes watching from the darkness. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't move. The ground seemed to pull at him, dragging him down into the earth. He clawed at the moss, but his fingers slipped, and the world spun around him. The last thing he saw was the tree, its branches reaching down to wrap around him, pulling him into the darkness. When Mara woke the next morning, Daniel was gone. His pack was still by the fire, his boots neatly lined up beside it. The others searched the woods, calling his name until their voices were hoarse, but there was no sign of him. The search party arrived that afternoon, combing the forest with dogs and radios, but Daniel had vanished without a trace. They found the clearing, eventually, but the tree was just a tree, old and gnarled, but nothing more. There were no footprints, no broken branches, nothing to show that anyone had ever been there. The searchers marked the spot on their maps and moved on, but Mara stayed behind, staring at the tree and listening to the wind in the branches. She thought she heard a voice, faint and far away, calling her name. She turned and walked back to camp, but the sound followed her, echoing through the trees. That night, she dreamed of Daniel, standing in the clearing, his eyes wide and empty, his mouth open in a silent scream. Years later, hikers still talk about the old fire tower and the boy who vanished in the night. Some say he got lost and died of exposure, his bones hidden beneath the moss. Others whisper that the forest took him, that he became part of the wild, another lost soul wandering the endless woods. Mara never went back, but sometimes, when the wind is right, she hears his voice in her dreams, calling her back to the place where the wild things wait. The first time anyone realized that the McAllister twins were missing, the rain had already started to fall in thick, cold sheets, turning the mountain trails to rivers of mud. The searchers would later say that the storm was the worst they'd seen in years, the kind that made the rivers rise and the old trees groan under the weight of the wind. But at the time, no one thought much of it. The twins were experienced hikers, local legends in their own right, and everyone assumed they'd just taken shelter somewhere, waiting for the weather to pass. They'd grown up in the shadow of the mountains, their childhood marked by long days spent exploring the woods and scrambling up rocky slopes. Their father, a park ranger, taught them how to read the land, how to find water, how to follow a trail even when the markers had faded to nothing. By the time they were teenagers, they knew every inch of the range, every hidden waterfall and secret cave. They were inseparable, their bond forged in the wild, places where most people feared to go. On the morning they disappeared, they set out early, their packs loaded with supplies and their spirits high. They planned to hike the Old Ridge Trail, a narrow path that wound its way along the spine of the mountain, offering views of the valley below. The sky was clear when they left, the air crisp and cool, and their father watched them go with a mixture of pride and worry. He knew the mountains could be dangerous, even for those who knew them best. The first sign that something was wrong came late in the afternoon, when the storm rolled in from the west, dark clouds boiling over the peaks. The wind picked up, tearing at the trees and sending flurries of leaves spinning through the air. The rain started as a drizzle, then quickly became a downpour, drumming on the roof of the ranger station and turning the trails to slick, treacherous mud. Their father tried to radio them, but there was no answer, just static and the distant rumble of thunder. He waited as long as he could, pacing the floor and watching the clock, But when darkness fell and the twins still hadn't returned, he knew something was wrong. He called in the search team, and by dawn, a dozen volunteers were combing the trails, their flashlights cutting through the mist and rain. The dogs picked up a scent near the old stone bridge, but it vanished at the edge of the river, washed away by the rising water. The search went on for days, the volunteers growing more desperate with each passing hour. The rain finally stopped, but the river was still swollen, its banks littered with debris. The searchers found a torn jacket snagged on a branch, a muddy boot print pressed into the soft earth, but no sign of the twins themselves. Their father refused to give up, leading the search deeper into the mountains, following every lead, no matter how faint. On the fourth day, he found something strange, a narrow path leading away from the main trail, hidden by a tangle of brambles and fallen branches. It wasn't marked on any map, and he couldn't remember ever seeing it before. The ground was soft, the mud churned by small, hurried footsteps. He called out, his voice echoing through the trees, but there was no answer. He followed the path, his heart pounding, until he reached a small clearing at the base of a cliff. In the center of the clearing stood an old stone well, its walls covered in moss and lichen. The well was ancient, older than the park itself, and the locals whispered that it was cursed, a place where the boundary between worlds was thin. The twins' father had always dismissed such stories as superstition, but now, standing in the clearing, he felt a chill run down his spine. He called out again, his voice trembling, and for a moment he thought he heard an answer, a faint, high-pitched cry, like a child calling for help. He rushed to the well, peering into the darkness, but he could see nothing, just the black, still water far below. He dropped a stone, listening for the splash, but the sound never came. The silence was absolute, pressing in on him from all sides. He searched the clearing, looking for any sign of the twins, but there was nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing to show that anyone had ever been there. He sat down on the edge of the well, his hands shaking, and tried to make sense of what he was feeling. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of wet earth and something else, something old and rotten. As he sat there, he began to notice things he hadn't seen before. The way the trees leaned toward the well, their branches twisted and bare, the way the grass grew in strange, swirling patterns around the stones. He felt as if he was being watched, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a move. He stood up, his legs unsteady, and turned to leave. As he did, he heard the cry again, louder this time, echoing up from the depths of the well. He ran back, shouting the twins' names, but the only answer was the wind in the trees. He dropped to his knees, peering into the darkness, and for a moment, he thought he saw something moving far below, a flash of red, the color of his daughter's jacket, a pale hand reaching up from the water. He reached down, his fingers brushing the cold stone, and the world seemed to tilt around him. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to jump, to let himself fall into the darkness and join his children in whatever place lay below. He fought the urge, pulling back at the last moment, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stumbled away from the well, crashing through the undergrowth until he reached the main trail. He called for help, his voice hoarse and broken, and the searchers came running. They found him sitting in the mud, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. He tried to tell them what he'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was point back toward the clearing, his hands shaking. The searchers found the well, but there was no sign of the twins. They lowered a rope, shining their flashlights into the darkness, but the well was empty, the water still and undisturbed. They searched the surrounding woods, but the trail vanished at the edge of the clearing, swallowed by the forest. The search was called off a week later. The twins declared missing, presumed dead, their father never stopped looking. He spent every spare moment in the woods, following every rumor, every whispered story of strange lights and voices in the night. He grew thin and gaunt, his eyes haunted by what he'd seen. The locals began to avoid him, crossing the street when they saw him coming, whispering that he'd gone mad with grief. Years passed, and the story of the McAllister twins became a cautionary tale, a warning to those who wandered too far from the marked trails. Some said the well was a gateway, a place where the lost could never return. Others claimed the twins had simply run away, tired of their small town and the weight of their father's expectations. But on stormy nights, when the wind howled through the trees and the rain beat against the windows, some people claimed they could hear voices calling from the woods, 2 voices, high and clear, singing an old lullaby their mother used to sing. And sometimes, if you listened closely, you could hear a 3rd voice, low and broken, calling their names into the darkness, hoping for an answer that would never come. The first time anyone realized that Dr. Evelyn Harper was missing, the sun had already dipped behind the granite peaks, and the air in the canyon was thick with the scent of sage and dust. The searchers would later say that the desert felt different that night, as if the land itself was holding its secrets close, unwilling to give them up. But at the time, no one thought much of it. Dr. Harper was a seasoned solo hiker, a respected biologist who had spent years mapping the remote canyons and arroyos of the Southwest. She knew the land better than most, and everyone assumed she'd simply lost track of time, caught up in her work. She'd arrived at the trailhead early that morning, her battered Jeep kicking up a plume of red dust as she parked beneath the twisted limbs of a juniper. She checked her gear, water, field notebook, camera, GPS, and set off into the wild, her boots crunching over the sun-baked earth. She was following rumors of a rare wildflower, a species thought extinct, said to bloom only in the shadow of the canyon walls. The locals called it ghost breath, and they warned her that the places it grew were best left undisturbed. Evelyn was not one to heed superstitions. She'd spent her life chasing the unknown, pushing past the boundaries of what others called safe. She hiked for hours, the sun climbing higher, the heat pressing down on her shoulders. She stopped to take samples, to photograph the strange patterns of lichen on the rocks, to sketch the delicate tracks of a kit fox in the sand. The canyon was silent except for the distant cry of a hawk and the whisper of wind through the creosote. By midday, she reached a narrow slot canyon, its walls rising sheer and smooth on either side. The air was cooler here, the light filtered in green. She paused to drink, her water bottle sweating in her hand, and checked her GPS. The signal flickered, then vanished, the screen blank. She frowned, tapping the device, but it refused to come back to life. She shrugged, slipping it into her pack. She'd always trusted her sense of direction more than any piece of technology. She pressed on, the canyon growing narrower, the walls closing in until she could touch both sides with outstretched hands. The ground was littered with bones, small, sun-bleached fragments of rabbit and lizard, the occasional antler from a long-dead deer. She knelt to examine them, noting the strange, spiral patterns etched into the surface, as if something had gnawed at them with teeth too small and too many. She stood, brushing dust from her knees, and caught a whiff of something sweet and cloying on the air. She followed the scent, her heart quickening, until she found a patch of pale, translucent flowers growing in the shadow of a boulder. Their petals shimmered in the dim light, almost invisible against the sand. She knelt, careful not to disturb the fragile stems, and began to sketch, her pencil moving quickly across the page. As she worked, she became aware of a sound, a low, rhythmic humming, like the distant drone of bees. She looked up, scanning the canyon, but saw nothing. The sound grew louder, vibrating in her chest, until she felt as if the very stones beneath her were singing. She stood, her sketchbook trembling in her hands, and turned in a slow circle. The canyon was empty, the flowers swaying gently in the breeze. She took a step back, her boot crunching on gravel, and the humming stopped. The silence was sudden and absolute, pressing in on her from all sides. She felt a prickle of unease, the hairs on her arms standing on end. She packed her things quickly, glancing over her shoulder as she made her way back toward the mouth of the canyon. But the way was not as she remembered. The walls seemed to shift, the path twisting and narrowing until she was forced to squeeze sideways between the rocks. The light faded, the air growing colder, and the scent of the flowers was replaced by something sharp and metallic. She tried to retrace her steps, but every turn led her deeper into the maze, the canyon walls closing in until she could barely breathe. She called out, her voice echoing off the stone, but there was no answer. She checked her watch, but the hands spun wildly, refusing to settle on any time. Panic fluttered in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. She'd survived worse: storms, flash floods, even a close encounter with a mountain lion. She just needed to keep moving, to trust her instincts. She walked for what felt like hours, the canyon twisting and turning, the walls growing higher and more jagged. She began to see strange markings on the stone, spirals and eyes, hands with too many fingers, shapes that seemed to writhe and shift when she looked away. She tried to ignore them, focusing on the feel of the ground beneath her boots, the rhythm of her breath. Eventually, she stumbled into a wide chamber, the ceiling lost in shadow. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, its surface covered in the same spiral patterns she'd seen on the bones. The air was thick with the scent of ghosts' breath, the flowers blooming in a ring around the altar, their petals glowing with an unearthly light. Evelyn approached, her heart pounding. She reached out to touch the stone, her fingers tracing the spirals, and the humming began again, louder than before. The air vibrated, the flowers swaying in time with the sound. She felt a pressure in her head, a voice whispering in a language she didn't understand. She tried to pull away, but her hand was stuck, the stone warm and pulsing beneath her skin. The voice grew louder, filling her mind with images, endless deserts, rivers of blood, faces twisted in agony. She saw herself, lost and alone, wandering the canyons for eternity, her bones joining the others in the sand. She screamed, wrenching her hand free, and stumbled back. The humming stopped, the flowers wilting in an instant. She turned and ran, her breath ragged, the walls of the canyon closing in around her. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing in the dust, her vision swimming with shadows. When she opened her eyes, the sun was high overhead, and the canyon was silent. She stood, her body aching, and looked around. The chamber was gone, the altar vanished, the flowers nothing more than a memory. She staggered to her feet, following the faintest trace of a trail, and eventually found her way back to the mouth of the canyon. Her Jeep was still there, dusted with red sand, the keys in the ignition. She climbed inside, her hands shaking, and drove back to town. She tried to tell her story, but no one believed her. They said she'd been out in the sun too long, that the desert played tricks on the mind. But Evelyn knew what she'd seen. She never went back to the canyon, never spoke of the ghost's breath again. But sometimes, late at night, she would wake to the sound of humming, the scent of flowers thick in the air, and she would remember the feel of the stone beneath her hand, warm and alive, pulsing with secrets too old to name. Years later, hikers still talk about the lost canyons and the biologist who vanished for a day and returned changed. Some say she found what she was looking for, that she brought something back with her from the depths of the earth. Others whisper that the desert took a piece of her soul, leaving her forever haunted by the wild places where the lost are never truly found. The first time anyone realized that the old man from the lakeside cabin was missing, the fog had already rolled in thick and low, swallowing the shoreline and muffling the world in a heavy, gray silence. The searchers would later say that the lake felt different that morning, as if the water itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. But at the time, no one thought much of it. The old man, known to most as Mr. Callahan, was a fixture of the woods, a solitary figure who had lived by the water's edge for decades. He was as much a part of the landscape as the pines and the loons, and everyone assumed he'd simply gone out fishing before dawn, as he always did. His cabin was a weathered thing, perched on stilts above the marshy ground, its windows clouded with age and its porch sagging under the weight of years. The locals said he'd come to the lake after his wife died, seeking peace in the wild places where no one could find him. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his voice was soft and rough, like gravel underfoot. He was kind to children, quick to share a story or a handful of wild berries. But he kept his own company, his eyes always scanning the water as if searching for something he'd lost. On the morning he disappeared, the fog was so thick you could barely see the end of the dock. The only sign of life was the faint glow of a lantern in the window and the distant call of a loon, echoing across the water. When the mail boat came by at noon, the captain noticed the cabin was dark, the door swinging open on its hinges. He called out, but there was no answer, just the soft slap of water against the pilings. The sheriff was called, and soon a small group of neighbors gathered at the cabin, their boots sinking into the wet moss as they searched the shoreline. Inside, the cabin was neat and spare, the bed made, the kettle still warm on the stove. Mr. Callahan's fishing gear was gone, but his old raincoat hung by the door, and his boots sat neatly on the mat. The only thing out of place was a single, muddy footprint on the porch, leading down to the water's edge. They searched the lake, their boats cutting slow circles through the fog, but there was no sign of him. The water was calm, the surface unbroken except for the occasional ripple of a fish or the shadow of a bird passing overhead. They called his name, their voices swallowed by the mist, but the only answer was the echo of their own words, bouncing back from the far shore. As the day wore on, the searchers grew uneasy. The lake had always been a place of stories, tales of drowned villages and ghostly lights, of things that moved beneath the surface, unseen and hungry. The old-timers spoke of a time when the water was lower, when the ruins of the old church could still be seen on the bottom, its steeple rising like a finger from the mud. They said the lake was deeper than it looked, that it had a way of keeping secrets. That night, the fog thickened, and the search was called off until morning. The neighbors returned to their homes, but a few stayed behind, sitting on the porch with lanterns lit, watching the water for any sign of movement. They spoke in low voices, sharing memories of the old man, how he'd once saved a boy from drowning, how he'd built his own canoe from cedar planks, how he'd never spoken of his life before the lake. As midnight approached, the fog began to lift, revealing the moon hanging low and red above the water. One of the neighbors, a young woman named Claire, noticed something strange, a faint light moving across the surface of the lake, bobbing and weaving as if carried by an unseen hand. She called to the others, and together they watched as the light drifted closer, growing brighter until it seemed to burn with a cold, blue fire. The light stopped at the end of the dock, hovering just above the water. For a moment, the world was silent, the only sound the gentle lapping of waves against the wood. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the fog, a tall, thin man, his clothes dripping with lake water, his eyes shining with an unnatural light. He walked up the dock, his footsteps leaving no mark, and paused at the edge of the porch. The neighbors stared, frozen in place, as the figure raised a hand in greeting. His voice, when it came, was soft and distant, like the echo of a memory. "I've come to say goodbye," he said, his words drifting on the night air. "The lake is calling, and I must go." Claire stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Mr. Callahan?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" The figure smiled, a sad, gentle smile, and nodded. "Don't be afraid," he said. "The wild is not what you think. It's not a place to be feared, but a place to be understood. I found what I was looking for. I'm not lost. Not anymore." With that, he turned and walked back down the dock, the light fading with each step. The fog closed in behind him, swallowing his figure until there was nothing left but the empty dock and the silent water. The next morning, the lake was calm and clear, the fog burned away by the rising sun. The searchers found no trace of Mr. Callahan, no footprints, no boat, no sign that he had ever been there at all. The only evidence was the muddy footprint on the porch, already drying in the morning light. In the weeks that followed, the neighbors spoke of what they had seen, their stories growing stranger with each telling. Some said the old man had been taken by the lake, claimed by the spirits that lived beneath the surface. Others believed he had simply walked away, tired of the world and ready to join his wife in whatever place lay beyond the wild. But Claire knew the truth. She returned to the cabin often, sitting on the porch and watching the water, waiting for the light to return. Sometimes, late at night, she would hear the sound of a canoe gliding across the lake, the soft splash of a paddle in the water. And sometimes, when the moon was full and the air was still, she would see a figure standing at the end of the dock, his eyes shining with the light of the wild, his voice calling her name across the water. The lake kept its secrets, as it always had, but those who listened closely could still hear the old man's words, carried on the wind and the waves. The wild is not a place to be feared, but a place to be understood. I'm not lost. Not anymore. The first time anyone realized that the group of college friends was missing, the first snow of the season had already begun to fall, blanketing the high country in a hush that muffled every sound. The searchers would later say that the mountains felt different that week, as if the storm had swept away not just the trails, but the very memory of those who had walked them. But at the time, no one thought much of it. The group, 5 friends from the university, all experienced hikers, had planned a weekend trek to celebrate the end of midterms. They were young, strong, and confident, and everyone assumed they'd simply been delayed by the weather. They set out on a Friday morning, their laughter echoing through the parking lot as they loaded their packs and checked their gear. The trailhead was quiet, the sky a pale, cloudless blue, and the air sharp with the promise of winter. They hiked quickly, eager to reach the backcountry cabin before nightfall. The path wound through stands of aspen and pine, the leaves already fallen, the ground soft underfoot. They stopped often to take photos, to joke and tease, to marvel at the silence of the woods by late afternoon. The first flakes of snow began to fall, swirling in the wind and settling on their shoulders. They pressed on, the trail growing harder to follow as the snow deepened. The map said the cabin was only a mile ahead, but the world had changed, the familiar landmarks hidden beneath a blanket of white. They argued about which way to go, their voices rising in frustration, but eventually agreed to follow the creek, trusting it would lead them to shelter. Night fell quickly, the darkness thick and absolute. Their headlamps cast narrow beams of light, illuminating only the nearest trees and the swirling snow. The wind picked up, howling through the branches, and the temperature dropped. They huddled together, their breath steaming in the cold, and tried to keep moving, their boots crunching through the drifts. They never found the cabin. The creek twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the forest, away from the trail. Their laughter faded, replaced by silence and the steady, relentless sound of the wind. They stopped to rest, building a small fire beneath a fallen log. But the wood was wet, and the flames sputtered and died. They wrapped themselves in emergency blankets, their bodies pressed close for warmth, and tried to sleep. In the darkness, strange sounds echoed through the trees, the snap of a branch, the distant cry of an animal, the soft, rhythmic crunch of footsteps in the snow. They told themselves it was just the wind, just the forest settling for the night, but none of them slept. They took turns keeping watch, their eyes wide and unblinking, searching the shadows for any sign of danger. By morning, the snow had stopped, but the world was unrecognizable. The trail was gone, the creek buried beneath a thick layer of ice. They tried to retrace their steps, but every direction looked the same: endless trees, endless white. Their food ran low, their water bottles froze, and their phones lost signal. Panic set in, sharp and cold, but they forced themselves to keep moving, to keep hoping. On the third day, they found a clearing, the snow trampled and stained with blood. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of stones, blackened by fire, and the remains of an old, collapsed shelter. They searched the ruins, hoping to find supplies, but there was nothing left, just ashes and bones, half buried in the snow. They huddled together, their fear growing with each passing hour. That night, the dreams began. Each of them dreamed of the same thing: a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, tall and thin, its face hidden in shadow. It called to them, its voice low and urgent, promising warmth and safety if they would only follow. In the morning, they compared their dreams, their voices trembling, and realized they had all seen the same thing. Desperation drove them to follow the figure. They left the clearing, moving deeper into the forest, their bodies weak with hunger and cold. The figure appeared often, always just ahead, its footprints vanishing in the snow. They called out, begging for help, but it never answered, never turned to show its face. One by one, they began to disappear. The first was Mark, the strongest of the group, who vanished while gathering firewood. The others searched for hours, calling his name, but found only his hat, half buried in the snow. The second was Julia, who wandered away in the night, drawn by the sound of the figure's voice. The third was Sam, who simply stopped walking, his eyes glazed and distant, and sat down in the snow, refusing to move. By morning, he was gone, his footprints leading into the trees. Only two remained, Lena and Chris, the quietest of the group, who clung to each other as the days stretched on. They rationed their food, melted snow for water, and tried to keep moving, but the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees growing taller and the sky darker with each passing hour. The figure appeared more often now, its voice growing louder, more insistent. On the seventh night, Lena woke to find Chris gone, his sleeping bag empty, his boots missing. She searched the camp, her heart pounding, but there was no sign of him, just a single set of footprints leading away from the fire, disappearing into the darkness. She followed them, her breath coming in ragged gasps, until she reached the edge of a frozen lake. The figure stood in the center of the ice, its arms outstretched, its face still hidden in shadow. Chris knelt at its feet, his head bowed, his body trembling. Lena called his name, but he didn't answer. The figure turned, its eyes glowing with a cold, blue light, and beckoned her forward. Lena stepped onto the ice, her boots slipping, her body shaking with fear and exhaustion. The ice groaned beneath her weight, cracks spiderwebbing out from her feet. She reached for Chris, her fingers brushing his shoulder, but he pulled away, his eyes empty and lost. The figure spoke, its voice echoing across the lake. "You are not lost," it said. "You are found. The wild remembers you. The wild keeps what it claims." The ice shattered beneath Lena's feet, plunging her into the freezing water. She gasped, her lungs burning, her body numb with cold. She saw the figure standing above her, its face finally revealed, a mirror of her own, twisted and hollow, its eyes filled with endless, swirling snow. When the searchers finally found the camp, weeks later, there was nothing left but a circle of stones and a few scattered belongings. The snow had covered everything, erasing all trace of the friends who had once laughed and joked beneath the trees. The only clue was a single set of footprints leading out onto the frozen lake and vanishing at the edge of a wide, black hole in the ice. The mountains kept their secrets, as they always had, but those who listened closely could still hear the voices of the lost, carried on the wind and the snow. You are not lost. You are found. The wild keeps what it claims. The wild is a place of beauty and terror, a realm where the rules of civilization fall away and the old, silent laws of nature take hold. For those who venture into its depths, the promise is always the same: freedom, adventure, a chance to touch something ancient and true. But the wild is also a place of mystery, a place where people vanish without a trace, leaving behind only questions and the ache of absence. The stories you've heard tonight are not just tales of missing hikers. They are echoes of a deeper truth, a reminder that the line between the known and the unknown is thinner than we care to admit. Each of these stories began with hope. Daniel, the quiet photographer, set out to capture the beauty of the forest, never imagining that the woods would swallow him whole. The McAllister twins, raised by the mountains, trusted their knowledge and their bond, only to find themselves at the edge of something older and darker than any map could show. Dr. Evelyn Harper, the scientist, believed in reason and evidence, but the desert had secrets that no field guide could explain. Mr. Callahan, the old man by the lake, sought peace in solitude, but found that the wild remembers every sorrow, every longing, and sometimes answers in ways we cannot understand. And a group of friends, full of laughter and bravado, learned too late that the wild does not care for youth or strength or plans made in the safety of daylight. What connects these stories is not just the horror of disappearance, but the way the wild transforms those who enter it. For some, the transformation is physical, a vanishing, a body never found, a footprint leading nowhere. For others, it is psychological, a haunting that lingers long after the search is called off and the world moves on. The wild does not always take. Sometimes it gives back, but what it returns is never quite the same as what was lost. There is a reason we are drawn to these stories, a reason we gather around campfires and whisper about the ones who never came home. The wild is a mirror, reflecting our deepest fears and desires. It is a place where we confront the limits of our knowledge, our strength, our courage. It is a place where we are reminded that we are not the masters of this world, but guests, temporary, fragile, and at the mercy of forces we can barely comprehend. For the families and friends left behind, the wild is a wound that never fully heals. The search for answers becomes a kind of pilgrimage, a journey into grief and memory. Every snapped twig, every distant cry, every shadow at the edge of the trail becomes a sign, a hope that the missing might still be found. But the wild is patient, and its secrets are well kept. Sometimes, the only closure is the knowledge that the lost are part of the land now, woven into the roots and stones, their stories carried on the wind. Yet, there is another side to these tales, a lesson, if we are willing to hear it. The wild is not just a place of loss, but a place of connection. It reminds us of our place in the world, of the bonds we share with each other and with the earth itself. It teaches us humility, respect, and the importance of listening to the land, to each other, to the quiet voice inside that warns us when we have gone too far. As you leave this story behind and return to the safety of your own world, remember the lost souls of the wild. Remember Daniel, the twins, Dr. Harper, Mr. Callahan, and the friends who vanished in the snow. Remember that every trail is a threshold, every forest a labyrinth, every mountain a mystery waiting to be solved. And remember, too, that the wild is not our enemy, but a part of us, a place of wonder and danger, beauty and fear, where the true horror is not just in what is lost, but in what we might find. If you ever find yourself standing at the edge of the wild, take a moment to listen. Listen to the wind in the trees, the call of the birds, the silence that settles when the sun goes down. Listen for the voices of those who came before, the ones who walked these paths and never returned. And if you feel the pull of the unknown, the urge to step off the trail and into the shadows, remember, the wild keeps what it claims, but it also remembers. Every story, every soul, every echo in the darkness. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the wild. May you walk your own path with courage, with respect, and with the knowledge that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. The wild is waiting, as it always has, and its stories are far from over.